Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our final morning of Hobbit Immersion Camp. I'll pass you over right away to Ms. Binkley as we're going to talk about chapters 18 and 19, the last two chapters in the book. And then I'm going to come back at the end to have a little further discussion with you. There's some I'd be happy to take other questions and to sort of talk about some more general themes of the book and stuff as we end, and kind of like Bilbo, return home and look back over the journey that he's had. So I will hand you over to Ms. Binkley. Have fun with chapters 18 and 19. Be back in a little bit.
Hi, everybody. Let's get started. Okay. We're going to start here on this page. We're talking about the return journey. Even though this is the title of the chapter, a lot of things happen in here besides the return journey. So we're going to start talking about where we left off yesterday. Remember, Bilbo had his helm on, and a boulder hits him on the head and knocks him unconscious, and he knows no more. So he doesn't know what's going on because basically he's out. So eventually he wakes up, and he sees a man walking around, and he looks out there on the plains, and it looks like there are people cleaning stuff up. He doesn't see any living goblins, so he says, oh, I guess maybe we won. I don't know. So anyway, he calls out to the man, and the man says, hey, what's that voice among the rocks? And it dawns on him, oh, I still have my ring on. So he takes the ring off, and the man picks him up and carries him to the camp because he's being called for. And let's see why he's being called for. So they take him to a tent, and he goes inside, and there's Gandalf. Gandalf's been injured. He's got his arm in a sling, and there on a bed is Thorin. And he walks up to Thorin, and Thorin is actually dying from wounds he's received in the battle. And Thorin says to him, farewell, good thief. He, meaning Thorin, said, I wish to part in friendship from you. And Bilbo responds, farewell, king under the mountain. There are a couple of really, really good and strong quotes from Thorin in this one. And even though they're really sad, and I do kind of get choked up and cry because it's such a sad part of the story for me, because I personally really like Thorin a lot. I thought he would have made a fabulous king. And obviously he's very brave because he leads a charge which turns the battle for quite a while. So he says goodbye to Bilbo. And he says, I go now to the halls of waiting to sit beside my fathers until the world is renewed. Since I leave now all gold and silver and go where it is of little worth, I wish to part in friendship from you, and I would take back my words and deeds at the gate. Remember, Thorin was calling him names, and when he discovered that Bilbo had given the men and elves the Arkenstone, Thorin was so angry that he was calling him his names, and he was actually even going to throw poor little Bilbo over the wall. And Gandalf says, don't harm my burglar. If you don't want him anymore, give him back to me. Thank you, thank you. So then Thorin also says that he's learned a lot from just knowing Bilbo. He says, if more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But sad or merry, I must leave it now. Farewell. And that's Thorin speaking. So Bilbo is devastated by this, and he just goes and he cries for quite a time. It's a very sad part of the story. And so let's go ahead and let me go ahead and move on to the next ones before I start crying here. So, oh dear, I can't scroll again. So I probably have missed several questions. The operating system that allows me to present to you and talk to you is not working again. Remember, we had that problem yesterday. I restarted before we started the class, and that didn't seem to solve the problem. But Jubilee is asking exactly who was the man that led Bilbo to the camp where Gandalf was. He was one of the men. He was sent to look on that hillside because, remember, Bilbo was crying, the eagles are coming, and people heard that. And Gandalf said, try up there on the hillside. And so he sent out men to look for him. This is the man who found him. He was one of the searchers. Amy, you have a question about Thorin and the Arkenstone, and we're going to hold on to that one for just a little bit. Corey, if you can hear me, I'm afraid that I'm going to have to restart because it's not my computer's completely frozen down. Now, I do not know why these two operating systems will not play together.
That's right. That's no problem.
Okay. Well, maybe you would like to talk a little bit about well, I have the whole, I'm talking about the end of the battle, so save that one for you, please.
Okay, no, I was just going to talk a little bit about Thorin then while you while you
Sorry
do that.
about this, everybody, but I apparently have a cranky computer.
No problem. So this, of course, is such an important moment, not only because of the friendship of Thorin and Bilbo, of course, and it is, as Ms. Binkley said, a really beautiful moment, and the sadness of the death of Thorin. It's a very complicated moment because, of course, it is very sad that he's dying and that Bilbo is losing his friend. But the thing I find that makes this scene so moving is that it's not only sad, but there's also happiness in it too, in two ways, right? First, that they're reconciled, that, you know, Thorin had been angry at Bilbo and had been, as Ms. Binkley said, threatening to kill him, in fact. You know, it looked like everything was at an end, and that in a way that, you know, although it had just seemed like the adventure was ending really well, unexpectedly well, right? They made it to the end. They recovered the treasure. They defeated the dragon, and, you know, everything seemed to be going perfectly well. And then everything got ugly, right? Everything got messed up as the things just got broken down between Bilbo and Thorin, and with the keeping of the Arkenstone and everything else that was happening there. So that was reconciled, and that was also by Thorin's humility, by Thorin's sacrifice, and Thorin's change of heart. But of course, it's not just that, even, right? It's not only just the relationship between between Bilbo and Thorin, but also Thorin's own state himself. We saw how he was suffering from, you know, what is called the dragon sickness, right? That is that sort of greed. It's not a physical sickness, right? It's a more like a spiritual sickness, you know, as he was there, focusing on the gold, right, and thinking greedy thoughts on this gold that a dragon had hoarded, and he was becoming dragonish himself. And I spoke a little bit yesterday about how that action that Bilbo takes in giving up the Arkenstone is, you know, the most undragonish thing, right, that anybody does. You know, everybody else is being greedy and focusing on the treasure, and Bilbo alone is giving up a treasure in order to establish peace and to let it not, you know, people not be fighting. And Thorin finally, now in his act of self-sacrifice at the end, I love how when he comes out, when he and the other dwarves charge out of the Lonely Mountain, they take that wall that they had built, they put a wall across the gate, right? And they throw down the wall, which is a really neat way of sort of showing like that enmity that I am keeping, you know, the wall that I put up to keep you guys out and to make us be enemies, I'm going to throw that down and I'm going to come out to your rescue. So Thorin, although he dies, has been saved, right? You know, he dies not just you know, dies well, you know, in a heroic action, but really changes his fate, you know, really changes what happens to him through that. And Bilbo recognizes that too, and you can see in his words as he's dying that he understands what he did wrong, you know, that he understands and has turned away from that. And that's another thing that makes it really beautiful. Okay, Ms. Binkley.
Hi, I'm back, and I'm not getting the funny clicking noise. So apparently,
that sounds good.
The computer multiple times is what the computer likes. So okay,
very good.
Thank you for filling in with that. And I was just listening to what you were saying about Thorin redeeming himself, and
yes.
I think that, yeah, it is, to me, it's really sad, but it's also really beautiful.
It is.
The way Tolkien has written this part of the story.
Yes.
So we have a couple of questions here, and I can't scroll your questions now, so there you go. there is something here that Amy's saying. Did you know that there were 20,000 people on the good side and 50,000 people on the bad guy side? Well, Amy, I don't know where your numbers came from, but I'm really liking those numbers. It shows you that even though they were outnumbered, they were still fighting the good fight. They really, really, really were not so much fighting for the treasure. They were fighting for the principle of the thing. Like, no, you can't just come in here and be mean to us, goblins and wargs, that is. And Gandalf was in the tent. Jubilee wanted to know. Yes, he was standing right there beside Thorin when Thorin dies. And the three pictures that I have here, I kind of picked them because they kind of show different moods. The one on this side here, you can kind of see on Bilbo's face the sadness. This one I really like because you can actually see in his body that he's just almost, you know, like, am I going to fall over and weep here? And this one here by Mr. Howe is, you know, it's just dark. It's a dark time. So anyway, these three pictures are really evocative. Will was wondering where that boulder that hit Bilbo came from. It just said from above. So whether it was dislodged in the battle or if somebody actually threw it at him. Remember, he was invisible, so I don't think he was actually a target that somebody had selected, like, oh, look, I'm going to throw this down and get that guy. I think that it was probably one that was being thrown at someone else or something that just came loose on the mountainside. And who wounded Thorin? We're going to talk about that in just a moment, CJ. And there were a couple of questions before I had to restart about the, we're going to take a look at the battle here on the next slide. But let me take a look at the rest of the questions here. Amy's wondering, without all of Thorin's companions, would he have turned into a dragon? Well, if you think about fairy tales, we were talking about yesterday about how people who really hoard gold and everything become dragonish. And Professor Olson was talking about men becoming dragon-like because they were hoarding the gold. I don't know that without his companions, because they were really kind of wanting to have all that gold as well. They were pretty much in agreement. Remember in the book, it only says that Fili, Kili, and Bomber were opposed to Thorin's actions of building the wall. The rest of them thought that it was a pretty good idea. So let's go ahead and take a look at the battle, because remember, Bilbo was knocked out. He doesn't know what happened. So let's take a look. I brought up this map again, so we can take a look here because we know, spoiler alert, eagles have come. So Miss Fonstad has drawn the eagles coming in at this direction. See that light brown dotted line? Those are the eagles approaching. And down here we have a little kind of dotted line, small dots, of Beorn coming. And you can see that he kind of goes out and back, all right? So here on the top one, which is a close in of this area here, you can see that the eagles are coming and they come towards Thorin. Beorn comes towards Thorin. Dwarves are coming in. The goblins and the wargs are coming around. They're being that flanking. Remember we talked about that? Flanking means that it comes around on both sides and kind of surrounds you. What happened to Thorin was when he came out, he was flanked. He did not have enough troops to actually spread out and move forward and surround the goblins. They were just simply outnumbered. So what happened was that he's down here in the middle battling. And remember, Bard and Dane and his men, Bard and his men, and Dane and his dwarves are over here, and the Elven King and Bilbo are over here on this side. Remember that the goblins and the second assault came in around the mountains and actually flanked the men, dwarves, and elves. Well, what happened with the eagles is they came in and they started attacking the goblins who were on the hillside, either knocking them off or actually attacking them. So that gave the men, elves, and dwarves down here in between these two arms of the mountain, it gave them more time to move forward in their attack. It still wasn't enough, even with the eagles. So let's talk about our next slide here. Okay, these are the same images that I put up yesterday for the eagles because it goes right back to that point of where Bilbo was knocked on the head, and we're going to start talking about that now. Remember how I told you the story kind of weaves back and forth in time? So now we're going to join up and move forward again. So here we have our images of the eagles here, two really dynamic pictures. It was it was, meaning the eagles, who dislodged the goblins from the mountain slopes, casting them over precipices or driving them down shrieking and bewildered among their foes. It was not long before they had freed the lonely mountain, and elves and men on either side of the valley could come at last to the help of the battle below. So, going back, if we can. Here's what it tells us. They came around here and actually drove the goblins down into this area where they could be surrounded by the elves, men, and dwarves. But like I said, they were still outnumbered. It still wasn't enough. So what happens next in our story, in the battle? In that last hour, Beorn himself had appeared. No one knew how or from where. He came alone and in bear shape, and he seemed to have grown to almost giant size in his wrath. Wrath means very, very angry. The roar of his voice was like drums and guns. He tossed wolves and goblins from his path like straws and feathers. He fell upon their rear and broke like a clap of thunder through the ring. The dwarves, that's where Thorin is, were making a last stand still about their lords upon a low, rounded hill. Then Beorn stooped and lifted Thorin, who had fallen pierced with spears, and bore him out of the fray. So to answer the question there, CJ, it was the goblin attack was just so big, and Thorin did not have enough men to protect himself and move out to, he was just ringed in by the goblins and the wargs. So he is there. Beorn comes in, picks him up, even though he's wounded, and carries him away. Now, this one here is actually a board game from the 1970s. I've never seen a copy of it. I have talked to people who've actually played this game, but they played it when they were children and they don't have the game anymore. I would love to see this game and, maybe even play it. That would be really fun. But I really like this one because you can see Beorn's pretty big. Also, I like the size of this warg here. Now that is one big warg, but you have to remember Beorn's further back. So this guy's in the front, so he's going to look bigger. And Beorn is really big back there. And you can see the eagles in the battle. You can see elves. You can see dwarves. Just so much detail. This one here I really liked because it says that he grew to monster size. He was really, really giant-sized in his wrath. So apparently the angrier he gets, the bigger he gets. I don't know. It just sounds like that. And you can see him just picking people up and flinging them and batting them around. And once again, we see the eagles in the back. And this one, remember, Thorin wore blue. And we can actually see Beorn picking him up here to carry him to safety. At this time, nobody knows that he's mortally wounded. They just know that Beorn knows he's wounded and needs to get him to safety. Will F. is wondering what the name of the Rankin Bass movie was. Well, it was called The Hobbit. And actually, you can probably, I know you can find it on a DVD because I have a copy of it on a DVD. But you can probably find it on the internet as well. I wouldn't know where to look for it because when I want to watch it, I just put my movie in the movie player and I watch it. So, but it's a really fun movie. But remember, Will and everyone else, that books and movies are not the same. And the Rankin Bass Hobbit movie is not the same as the book. There are lots of reasons for that, because a book and a movie are actually two different kinds of stories. And a book can tell a story one way, and a movie can tell a story another way. And even though the stories may be similar, there will be a lot of differences. So always keep that in mind. So we have a few more questions here. Jubilee is wondering if it was Bolg who killed Thorin to get revenge on Bolg's father. Actually, Thorin did not kill Bolg's father. It was Dane who killed Bolg's father. It was Azog, Bolg's father, who killed Thror. That's Thorin's grandfather. So there's a lot of animosity going on between this particular group of dwarves and this particular group of goblins. I mean, they've got a lot of old hatred going on, and so I imagine they do bring that to battle. So let's go ahead and take a look at our next slide here. I'll make sure I've got everything. Oh, Beorn is the one who actually breaks. So he carries Thorin to safety, and then he comes back, and he seriously is the battle changer here. Remember, even though the eagles were there, they were still outnumbered. Once Beorn arrived, he fell upon the goblins and the wargs so heavily that he managed to pierce through Bolg's guard, and he grabs and kills Bolg. Once the captain, the leader, Bolg is dead, goblins start fleeing because they don't have a leader anymore to tell them what to do and how, and to keep them going forward in this battle. So basically, it is Beorn who is the element that changes the back and forth of this battle to now the good guys, the elves, dwarves, men, eagles, I guess we could say, and Beorn are all now moving forward in this battle. The battle has finally turned. So let's take a look at our next slide. Now Thorin has died, and they are going to bury him in a ceremony. This picture here by Mr. Lee is just really, really, really kind of evocative. There they are. You can see they've got torches. It's not exactly dark, but it's not exactly light because they are under the mountain. They are in the caverns. They buried Thorin deep beneath the mountain, and Bard laid the Arkenstone upon its breast. This is what Bard says. There let it lie until the mountain falls. He said, may it bring good fortune to all his folk that dwell here ever after. And then, remember, when Thorin was captured by the Elven King's folk, they took his sword away. Well, the Elven King has the sword. And upon his tomb, the Elven King then laid Orcrist, the elvish sword that had been taken from Thorin in captivity. It is said in songs that it gleamed ever in the dark if foes approached, and the fortress of the dwarves could not be taken by surprise. So now Thorin, who is the king under the mountain, is dead. And Dane steps in to take the place because Dane would be next in line because he is a kinsman of Thorin. So he becomes the king under the mountain. And one of the cool things about being king with a lot of treasure is you can give it away to people that have helped you, and people that are suffering, and people that maybe just need a little bit of help. So Dane starts to deal out the fortune under the mountain because now he's king. So what he does is he crowns the king of the Lord of the Eagles, he crowns him with gold in thanks for all of the help that they've given him. He gives Bard, remember Bard is from the town of Dale and he's descended from the line of Girion. He gives Bard the emeralds of Girion, and because the family of Girion had treasured these emeralds. And Bard, in thanks to the Elven King for coming to the help of the men of the lake, he actually gives them to the Elven King, which I think is really a sweet gesture. It's like, here, you are a person who really values jewels and things of beauty. Here's things of beauty for you. And now, remember that Bilbo had his 1/14 share. And since Bilbo gave the Arkenstone to the elves and men so they could trade it, Thorin had said, you can have Bilbo's 1/14 share. You can have all of the gold that is wrought and unwrought, but I'm not giving you any jewels. And Dane steps up and says, you know what, I'm going to honor that, and that you will have 1/14 share of the gold. And that is a wealth, a fortune. Most kingdoms wouldn't have this money. So now the people of Lake Town are set up. They don't have to worry about rebuilding their town. It's going to be, you know, they're going to have the funds to do that. And then Dane turns to Bilbo and says, you know, no matter that you gave up your 1/14th share, I would, you know, there's so much here. I think you should just have a great big huge pile of treasure too. And Bilbo says, no, 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 I don't need a big pile of treasure. And he settles for just one small chest of gold and one small chest of silver, which is as much as a strong pony can carry, because he doesn't want to have to figure out how to take an entire mountain of treasure all the way back to Hobbiton. I mean, you know, number one, transportation would be extremely difficult. And number two, he'd be robbed all the way there. So he says, no, 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 let's just take a small amount. So we have some questions. Let's take a look at these. Did Beorn have any brothers or sisters? CJ wants to know. CJ, I never really heard it mentioned that he had any siblings. I think that there's a mention that his family was from the Misty Mountains, but just in passing, not really focused on. So you can let your imagination run to the fact that he did have relatives, although it's not really mentioned. And CJ said, why did none of the other dwarfs die? Well, CJ, we're going to talk about that in just a minute. And Jubilee has another question. The Dane was from the Iron Hills. Was there treasure there too? They were mining. And yes, they had a city there. And, you know, there were a lot of dwarves there, but they didn't have the treasure that Thror and Thrain had and that the dragon came for. And they didn't, you know, also remember the treasure of Dale, which is a very rich city, was also in there in this the dragon hoard as well. So now it's time to go home. Bilbo's tired. You know, his good friend Thorin is dead. So off they go. So they decide that they're going to, the Elven King is going back to his elven halls. Beorn is going back to his home. Here we have Gandalf. Here's Bilbo and his little pony. I've looked at this picture several times, and I really don't see a pony carrying the chest of gold and silver. But, you know, this is this artist's mind movie. I would have put it in there. Maybe I should draw my own drawing, I guess. So this is what happens. Gandalf and Bilbo rode behind the Elven King, and beside them strode Beorn, once again in man's shape, and he laughed and sang in a loud voice upon the road. They, Gandalf and Bilbo, intended to go along the edge of the forest, meaning Mirkwood, round its northern end in the waste that lay between it and the beginnings of the Grey Mountains. Moreover, Beorn was going that way too. And as we can see, Beorn's a pretty formidable guard, so I think that was a wise choice. So anyway, Dane had also given Bilbo a beautiful necklace and pearls and silver. And Bilbo goes up to the Elven King and says, here, I want you to have this. And the Elven King goes like, why? And Bilbo says, because like I used a lot of your hospitality, so I want you to have this. And the Elven King says, why, thank you. And they part. Now, let's take, one more thing I did want to mention is that the Elven King names Bilbo an elf friend, being a friend of the elves of the wood. I don't know what significance that really has, but it does come up in other of Tolkien's writings about elf friends. So that might be something that you could take a little bit of research on. So I really have always wondered about that, but have never really taken the time to explore it. Amy wanted to know how Bilbo would go back through the Misty Mountains. Well, we're going to take a look at his travel map. Now remember, this is the one we've been looking at through the entire course. They started here, they wanted to go all the way across and up. They ended up instead going under the mountains, so on and so forth, and then down this path captured by the Elven King, so on. Now they're leaving the Lonely Mountain, and they're going around this way. It's Gandalf, Bilbo, and Beorn, and they come to Beorn's house, and they actually spend the winter there. And they say that it was a merry Yule, and remember we talked a little bit about celebrations and holidays, and Yule was a celebration in the winter time. So they spend the time there, and then in the spring, they go back over here. But now that the goblins are gone, or severely reduced in numbers, crossing the mountain path is actually pretty easy. So let's talk about your journal entries, because this will answer one of our questions earlier. Oh, here's a nice picture. I'd forgotten that I'd put this one in here. By midwinter, Gandalf and Bilbo had come all the way back along both edges of the forest to the doors of Beorn's house, and there for a while they both stayed. Yuletide was warm and merry there. So here we have a little Bilbo. I just really like this picture. And then here we have another picture of Beorn's house. So for your journal this time, I want you to sketch Thorin and Bilbo's last meeting. Hopefully you won't cry through it, because I always cry when I think that's part of the story. And then our answer is, why was Bilbo not seen after the battle? And then for your second sketch, sketch Thorin's grave with the Arkenstone and Orcrist. And then the question that I want you to answer is, name the dwarves who died in the battle, and then write their names in runes. So let's take a look at our first question. Why was Bilbo not seen after the battle? Then Bilbo remembered his ring. Well, I'm blessed, said he. This invisibility has its drawbacks after all. Otherwise, I suppose I might have spent a warm and comfortable night in bed. But instead, he was out there laying invisible on the rocks all night in the cold, because remember, it is winter. Let's look at our next question, and this should answer it. These are the dwarves who died in the battle. Now, I could not write their names in runes for you, but you do have your rune decoder, and it is a fun thing to write names in runes. I actually do it all the time. I just didn't have the supplies to do it here. So Thorin, Fili, and Kili all died in the Battle of the Five Armies. Fili and Kili died defending their uncle, Thorin. And so they are of the royal house, and they are the last of the royal house. So that's why Dane, who's also related to them, steps in as king. So hopefully, CJ, that answers your question, because these are the three dwarves who did die in the Battle of the Five Armies. Let's go ahead and take a look at the last chapter. This is called The Last Stage. So they cross the Misty Mountains through the pass, and they're safe, but they're tired. So you can see this one. This is one of Tolkien's own sketches. It's called Riding Down into Rivendell, and I just really like this one because it looks like he's on a little fat pony riding down here into the valley where Rivendell is located. It was on May the 1st, the two, Gandalf and Bilbo, came back at last to the brink of the valley of Rivendell, where stood the last, or the first, homely house again. Again, it was evening. Their ponies were tired, especially the one that carried the baggage, and all felt in the need of rest. So they're welcomed in, and they get rest, and the elves are still singing, and Bilbo's now real happy because he really enjoys the elves of Rivendell. So let me check in my notes here. So they arrive in Rivendell, and this is where Bilbo learns about Gandalf's business. Remember, he left them at the gate, the forest gate of the elf path and Mirkwood, and he had business of his own, so he rode the pony back to Beorn, or his horse rather, back to Beorn's house, and then drops out of the story for a while. He doesn't come back until the night that Bilbo sneaks out and gives the Arkenstone to the elves and men. So we'll talk about that in a moment, what his business was. So Gandalf and Bilbo continue on their journey towards Bag End. Now remember that whenever they encountered the trolls, they found the two swords, Glamdring and Orcrist. That's where Bilbo found the little dagger that he named Sting, because the dagger is big enough for let me start over. It's as big enough for a sword. I've been speaking too much Italian. My adjectives and my articles are out of line. Anyway, Bilbo's sword, he names it Sting. So anyway, they've also found gold, and they buried it. And here you can see them digging the gold out of the ground. And here's a little pony. I always thought in this particular drawing, that pony looked concerned, like, am I carrying more stuff? I got like a case of gold on me and a case of silver. What else? But not far from the road, they found the gold of the trolls, which they had buried, still hidden and untouched. I have enough to last me my time, said Bilbo, when they dug it up. You had better take this, Gandalf. I dare say you can find a use for it. Indeed I can, said the wizard. But then he says this, one of my favorite lines in the whole thing. But share and share alike. You may find you have more needs than you expect. So let's take a look here at our last part of our story. Why is the first in parentheses? Jubilee, I don't know what you're talking about here, sweetie. So let me see. Let me go back. Oops, did not go back. Okay, first in parentheses. Oh, I know what you're talking about. They called it the last homely house because as you were going east into the wild, it was the last homely house you were going to meet. Homely, remember, is not plain. Homely means welcoming, like welcoming you home. But whenever you are going west and you cross the Misty Mountains, it would be the first homely house, the first warm welcoming after you left the wild. So that's why Tolkien put it in there. So it was called the last homely house because most people are going the other way into the wild. But now when you come back, it's the first homely house. Excellent question. I like that one. Where is, Declan has a really good question actually. This one here, where is Frodo in the events of The Hobbit? Not born yet. He hadn't even been born. Okay, so it's still talking to me in a cranky manner. Here's where we want to be. Okay, so they finally arrive at Bag End, and I like this picture because look at this guy here. He's like holding up a shirt like, is this going to fit me? And this guy, these people here are carrying away furniture. And here is Bilbo with his pony, and it looks, and the other thing I really like about this, it never says that Bilbo is wearing his armor. But remember, he wore his coat over his armor. And here it looks like he's wearing a helm, wearing armor, I mean, all the way down to his toes, and carrying a shield, a spear. And I really like this one because he kind of looks like he means business. So let's talk about what happens when he gets home. He, Bilbo, arrived back in the middle of an auction. There was a large notice in black and red hung on the gate stating that on June the 22nd, Messrs. Grubb, and Burrows would sell by auction the effects of the late Bilbo Baggins, Esquire of Bag End, Underhill, Hobbiton. In short, Bilbo was presumed dead, and not everybody that said so was sorry to find the presumption wrong. So, remember that Gandalf said you may need this troll gold? Because what ended up happening is that he had to have himself declared alive again and buy back all of his stuff. So anyway, he finally gets his home set up again after spending all this money that he acquired on his adventure. And then he's at home. And one autumn evening, some years afterwards, that means after he's back and settled back in home again, Bilbo was sitting in his study writing his memoirs. Remember, these are his memoirs. He thought of calling them There and Back Again, A Hobbit's Holiday. I wouldn't call it a holiday, it's more of an adventure. When there was a ring at the door, it was Gandalf and a dwarf, and the dwarf was actually Balin. So they did come visit him. And so whenever they're sitting there talking, Gandalf tells Bilbo the news about Dale, Laketown. Dale and Laketown. Dale's been rebuilt. Laketown's been rebuilt. That now the Erebor, the city under the mountain, has been restored. Things are going along swimmingly for all of his old friends. But Gandalf, I really like this part too, tells Bilbo that he really actually is a little person. And he had a lot of luck, but maybe it wasn't really luck. Maybe it had to do with prophecies. And it was just Bilbo being at the right place at the right time to make the prophecies come true. And I thought that was really adorable. So let's see if we have some questions here before we take a look at our journal entries. So let's just move into those. So sketch Bilbo's welcome home party in Rivendell. It's described in the book as being quite a festivity with singing and so on. So that might be a fun thing for you to draw. Then remember, Gandalf left the company at Mirkwood. What did Gandalf do? Then sketch the auction at Bag End. And I think that one's going to be really a lot of fun. And the answer for this one is, who came to visit Bilbo? Well, we just talked about that, but let's take a look at our first question. Remember, Gandalf left the company at Mirkwood. What did Gandalf do? It was in this way that he, meaning Bilbo, learned where Gandalf had been to, for he overheard the words of the wizard to Elrond. It appeared that Gandalf had been to a great council of the White Wizards, masters of lore and good magic, and that they had at last driven the necromancer from his dark hole in the south of Mirkwood. That's where he went. And who came to visit Bilbo? It was Gandalf and a dwarf, and the dwarf was actually Balin. So that comes to the end of my presentations on The Hobbit. And I hope that you had a chance to read all the way through the book. If you didn't, make sure that you take some time and get yourself all caught up. Remember to finish your journal. Remember, this is your journey through Middle-earth as a member of the company, and the things you saw and the things that they did. And I'm going to miss talking to you guys. So thanks so much for attending.
Absolutely. Right. And we have a couple minutes left for questions for me and for me to, I had a couple things that I wanted to kind of emphasize here as we came to the end of the book. And one is just to sort of think about, one of the things that I find really fun about The Hobbit is the way that you can begin to see sort of the larger shape of it when you sit back and look at it. You know, one thing that really struck me a little while back when I was reading The Hobbit was, you remember in chapter 11 when they're sitting on the doorstep, right? When they're still trying to figure out how to get the secret door open. And there's that scene when Bilbo is sitting there on the doorstep with his back against the door. And there he is on the mountain. He's at the end of his journey, right? In thinking back to when they had, the dwarves had come into his parlor at Bag End, and you know, they originally talked about their journey to the mountain. And he's sitting at the mountain, and he's looking backwards into the west, back towards where his little hill is. And of course, that is what made me remember for the first time that, of course, where Bilbo lives is called the hill, right? And where they're going to is called the mountain. And you notice the parallel there, right? With Bilbo and his cozy little hobbit hole that he loves so much in his hill, and then the mountain with the treasure that the dwarves want so much at the end of their journey, right? And you can begin to see how, of course, Bilbo is going along with the dwarves on their journey, but this is really Bilbo's journey, right? And Bilbo's journey isn't over when he gets to the mountain. Bilbo's journey is over when he gets back to the hill, right? In the end, what Bilbo was seeking for, you know, the destination of Bilbo's journey was Bag End, was the hill, was his own home, right? He had to go to the mountain, he had to go there and then go back again. And that's where his own treasure lies. And even though he comes home with treasure, right? He comes home with his gold and silver, and he comes home with his mithril coat and his magic ring and all of these things that, you know, he did not have before. You'll remember what he has really valued, right? What has really meant a lot to him. You remember what he keeps remembering, right? The thing that that the narrator keeps telling us that Bilbo is imagining when he's in awkward places and scary places and painful places in his journey is sitting next to his fire with the kettle just beginning to sing, right? He's always remembering that. And, you know, the thing that we see, if you think back to the beginning of chapter 1, when we were when we're introduced to Bilbo for the very first time, and you remember about his parents, right? His father was a Baggins, right? Bungo Baggins, and his mother was Belladonna Took. And the narrator tells us, remember, that although, you know, he looks like a second edition of his Baggins father, he also got something a bit queer in his makeup, right? He got something a little strange and adventurous from the Took side, because we know those Tooks are a little bit more adventurous than normal hobbits, right? And we can, and from the very beginning, from that point on in chapter 1, one thing that you can notice when you read through carefully is that the narrator keeps pointing out this division within Bilbo, right? He's got his Baggins side and he's got his Took side. He's got that part of him that likes things to be normal and predictable and quiet, and then he's got that other, and that really values his home and his comfort and all of those things, second breakfast on the lawn and smoking his pipe and all of those things. And then you have the adventurous side. Remember when he gets up, when he faints dead away, right, and they sit him off in the other room, and then he overhears the dwarves and Gandalf talking about him, and specifically Glóin saying that he looked more like a grocer than a burglar, right, and the dwarves wondering if he's going to be any good, and Gandalf must have made a mistake, and Bilbo gets really angry, and he storms into the other room and says, "Pardon me, right, if I've overheard words that you were saying," and that's when he signs up for the adventure, right? And you may remember the narrator says the Took side had won, right, when he does that, and that the Baggins side often regretted what the Took side did, but the Took side had won there, and that's why he started on the adventure. What we begin to see as time goes on through the book, Bilbo never loses his Baggins side. Even though he is on his adventures and he is, he is learning a lot and experiencing a lot, he never loses. It's not a story about how somebody who is like kind of quiet and boring became a bold adventurer, right? It's not that at all. As we see, thinking back to what we were talking about just a little while ago with the death scene of Thorin, right? That's what Thorin acknowledges too. Remember, Thorin says, if more people valued, food and cheer above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. In other words, it's the Baggins side, not the adventuresome side, right? The treasure-seeking side. It's the Baggins side that that Thorin acknowledges and says, he didn't have any use for it, right? The rest of the dwarves all actively looked down on him when they first met him, and he was all Baggins-ish all the time, right? And only after he looked like he was going to become a first-rate burglar, right, after he escaped from the Misty Mountains and they found he had an invisible ring and all that stuff, they began to really respect him. But we see that Thorin, in the end, respects his Baggins side and understands that that's a really good way of seeing things. But the Baggins side has changed as he gets back home at the end. This is not just a return to being quiet and normal and boring, right? Bilbo has changed. His whole view of the world is different. And it's not that his Baggins side has gone quiet or gone away, but the two of them have been combined. And that image of Bilbo at the end, right? He returns back to his home and he's sitting there by his fireside, and he's loving the sound of his kettle just beginning to sing so that he can make tea, just like he was thinking about all throughout his adventure. And yet his fireside now has his magic sword up on the wall, right? His magic armor standing in the corner, and he has his magic ring in his pocket. His adventure is still there. All those Tookish things are still now a part of his life. Before, he was only sort of living half of that, and now he has sort of discovered both sides of him, and both of them are sort of happy and acting together. And it's a really neat picture of Bilbo. And you'll notice how he shows his own thinking about how he has changed is in the song that he sings as he's just about to get home, as the hill begins to come into view, and he sings his song, The Road Goes Ever On and On song. The first version of that, of course, you may remember that a new version of that song Bilbo sings in The Lord of the Rings, in the Fellowship of the Ring, and in The Return of the King, actually. But anyhow, he sings this first version of the song, and Gandalf looks at him and he says, "Bilbo, you are not the same person that you were," right? And it's really neat to see that Gandalf can see that he's changed and grown and become sort of not a totally different person, but really become a bigger person. Become a fuller person than he was before, and that's really cool. All right. Yeah.
Will just ask a question about the necromancer.
Yes. Okay. Does the necromancer appear later? He certainly does. And actually, it's connected with the question that CJ just asked, too. CJ's asking, is the building in the Lord of the Rings with the big eye on top of it in The Hobbit? No. Well, first of all, again, that's another movie thing, right? In Peter Jackson's Mind movie, there's a big actual fireball eye on top of the Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower. That's not described in the book. The tower is there, not the flaming eyeball, literally. It's more of a that Sauron is there and he can see and everything, but it's not actually literally a flaming eyeball. But anyway, that tower is in Mordor, right? That's where Sauron the Dark Lord has set up, and that's the necromancer, right? Gandalf. It only mentions it in like 2 paragraphs in chapter 18. Oh, shoot, I'm forgetting whether it's the end of 18 or the beginning of 19. The 19 is when they return to Rivendell, right? The beginning of chapter 19? Yeah, okay.
Chapter 19.
Yeah, it's in chapter 19. Okay. In chapter 19, when they get back to Rivendell, Gandalf has a conversation with Elrond in which Gandalf explains where he went when he separated from them at Beorn's house, and where he went was to a meeting of the White Wizards, and they got together and kicked the necromancer out of Mirkwood. They drove him out. And in The Lord of the Rings, we will learn that the necromancer was Sauron, the Dark Lord, and he returned to Mordor. He had been rebuilding the Dark Tower there in Mordor, and so he retreats from Mirkwood, but returns to Mordor and sets himself up there. So that's Jubilee, who the necromancer is. He is Sauron, the Dark Lord, the enemy who is trying to take over the world in The Lord of the Rings. And of course, it turns out that he will have a special interest in Bilbo, Frodo, and their ring when we get to The Lord of the Rings. So yes, that is a really important question in thinking about the transition from The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings. And again, it's kind of fun because you miss it, right? If you don't read carefully there at the beginning of chapter 19, that one short paragraph where Gandalf says where they went and what they were doing, then you can easily miss that. Excellent. So, and I'm so thanks for those of you who have been expressing how much fun you had in this camp. We have had an awesome time too. Several of you are asking, are we going to do a camp like this next year? Absolutely, we're going to do a camp like this next year. We have had way too much fun not to do something like this next year. You guys want to do a Lord of the Rings immersion camp? You have expressed your interest in that. That seems to me quite likely that we will do something of that kind next year. So please do keep an eye out, and have your parents keep an eye out for emails. We're going to be sending some emails with some just asking for some feedback for you guys. We'll send you some short surveys to get some information, because we really want to know what were things that you liked, what are some other stuff you would like, are there other books you would like to do, are there ways in which we could do this camp next year and make it even more awesome. So we really hope to hear from you guys about that stuff, and I promise you, the stuff you guys tell us, we are really going to be looking very carefully at that and interested in following up on the things that you want. CJ mentions maybe a Harry Potter camp. We were thinking about that, CJ. That's actually another plan. Yeah, that's one of the plans. I would love to see us do a camp not only on the Lord of the Rings, but also on Harry Potter, and maybe also on the Chronicles of Narnia, because that's awesome too. So we'll see. Anyway, it's whatever is going to happen. It's going to be great fun. But thank you for joining us, and I hope you guys will. I hope that you'll respond and tell us all the stuff that you can about camp to help us make it better next year. And then next year we will come back and we will do another even more awesome camp for next year. So thanks everybody. Stay in touch, and we really enjoyed. We're so glad that you were with us here this year for our first ever Hobbit Immersion camp. Thanks everybody.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.